For some people, the Abbey is just a pile of ruins that are a bit of a mystery. For others, it's a peaceful green space in the middle of the town. To understand what the Abbey was and what part it played in history takes a great deal of imagination, because so little is left of the imposing range of buildings which once stood here. The men who toiled with their bare hands to build it, and the holy monks who spent their lives in the service of God, are long gone. If you are new to Kilwinning, or new to local history, or if you just enjoy stories, this will be an introduction to 1,400 years of the story of our Abbey.
Legend tells us that sometime probably in the 6th or 7th century, a holy man called Winning or Vinnan sailed up the River Garnock in a small boat. His mission was to bring Christianity and learning to the barbaric people of this part of Scotland in the tradition of St. Columba and the other missionaries of the time. There are alternative versions in which his name changes and even his nationality, but most historians agree that he set up a small church or kill beside the river, probably on raised ground. It is said that St. Winning was buried in the area where the Abbey stands today. The only evidence that exists of this period is some fragments of a carved stone cross known as the Kilwinning cross, the only known freestanding cross in Ayrshire produced in the local Strathclyde tradition of early medieval sculpture. The main fragment is held in the North Ayrshire Heritage Centre in Saltcoats and depicts a hunting scene on one side and an intricate knot pattern on the reverse. Known by some as St. Winning's Cross, it is at least 2 or 3 centuries older than the Abbey, and its existence suggests early Christian worship in the area. This timeline is intended to show the development of the Abbey site in relation to the wider historical events in Scotland and in Europe. In the 12th century, during an enormous upsurge of religious activity in Europe, a huge building programme of abbeys, monasteries and convents took place throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Here, land was granted by the pioneering King David I to the de Morville family, Hugh, Richard and another Hugh, to build an abbey and monastic centre in Kilwinning. This family was of French Norman lineage, and they sent for mason monks from Normandy to undertake the construction. Since abbey charters have been lost over time, there are a number of theories about the exact date of the foundation of the abbey, but it was at some time, probably in the mid-1100s. This was the start of the period of huge power and influence wielded by the Catholic Church throughout Europe, which lasted until the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. This picture from a medieval French illuminated manuscript gives an idea of construction techniques in medieval times. Stone blocks were quarried from local sources, transported by horse and cart, and cut by skilled craftsmen. The blocks were then carried or hoisted into place to form walls, pillars, towers, stairs, windows, and elaborate mouldings that have withstood the tests of centuries. Building was seasonal work, as no outside work was possible from November to March, so the building of an abbey took many years, and some of the masons spent their whole lives on the project. The monks at Kilwinning were Benedictine monks, followers of the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasised peace, work and prayer. Their order, called the Tyrrhenensian order, originated in Tyrone in Normandy, northern France. It's now known as Tyrone-Gardey. The Mother Abbey of Tyrone still stands and is used today as a church. The monks' strict rules included worship, prayer, and manual labour in the building and maintenance of the abbey. Other monks from the Tyronnensian order followed, and there were eventually 4 major abbeys in Scotland at Arbroath, Kelso, and Lindores in Fife, as well as Kilwinning. Many other abbeys and monasteries were built throughout Scotland by different monastic orders. This map shows the location of the main abbeys and priories throughout Scotland, with the Tyronnensian abbeys marked in red. The chief monk in an abbey was called the abbot, and he governed the other monks and was answerable to the king. Every day for the monks was marked by 7 services, beginning before dawn, when they would file down the night stair from their dormitories and assemble in the chancel of the abbey and recite the first prayers of the day. When the sun rose and shone through the great east window, they recited the second prayers. They were called to prayer by the great bell in the central tower. They returned after 8 o'clock to take part in further prayers and masses. They then lined up in procession to take part in the most important part of the day, their meeting in the chapter house. There they would listen to a chapter from the Rule of St. Benedict and discuss the business of the day with the abbot. Further services took place at intervals throughout each day, ending very late at night, before beginning again early the next morning. The day would be spent in manual labour, repairs, tending the beehives and fruit and vegetable gardens, and stocking the fish ponds. Some would be involved in copying manuscripts. Some of the monks were men of great learning. Abbeys were always built to a standard plan, which varied little throughout Europe. The main building, the worship space, was usually built in the footprint of a cross pointing east, with 2 arms or transepts facing north and south. The main body of the church was the nave, with a door at the west end, through which lay people were allowed to enter for worship. At Kilwinning, the nave was remarkable for its width, 100 feet or 30 metres, wider than either Glasgow Cathedral or Paisley Abbey. It also had at its western end 2 large freestanding towers. At the eastern end was the chancel, the most sacred part of the church, where the high altar stood under the great east window. Outside the church, to the south side, were the monks' living quarters, the chapter house, and other buildings arranged around an open square garden or courtyard area called the cloisters. Monks used this area for peaceful reflection and reading and writing. This plan shows in more detail the layout of the abbey and the approximate construction dates of the remaining structures. The oldest part is the wall between the south aisle and the cloisters, dating from the 1160s. The most recognisable feature still standing is the gable wall of the south transept, built almost 800 years ago. This plan also shows the present-day Abbey Church, built over the foundations of the original chancel. As no one knows what Kilwinning Abbey looked like when it was completed, or even if it was ever completed, which seems doubtful, this is an artist's impression based on the footprint of the foundations which are visible today and on other abbeys which have survived in better condition. Note the two towers at the western end and the gable wall of the south transept which still stands. Monks were allocated different responsibilities. The almoner looked after the poor people seeking help. The cellarer was in charge of the bakehouse and brewhouse. The hosteler looked after visitors. The infirmarian cared for the sick. The sacrist looked after the monastery's treasure. In overall charge was the abbot. Another artist's impression, this time a digital one, which gives a good view of the possible layout of the cloisters and the monks' living quarters. Other buildings, often to be found at abbeys and monasteries, were kitchens, wine cellars, and a refectory or a dining room. Separate buildings often included the abbot's house and an infirmarium where the sick were tended. As time went on, the abbeys grew more and more rich, and the abbots who had the king's ear became more powerful and in some cases ruthless. Kilwinning Abbey's lands extended widely throughout North Ayrshire, up the river valleys as far as Kilmarnock, Beath, and even as far as part of Arran. Tenants who lived and worked on the land had to pay rent to the abbey or be evicted. The ordinary people who could not understand the Bible, which was written in Latin, were ruled by fear and superstition, reinforced by the teachings of the priests. Wealthy and powerful landowners believed they could buy their way into heaven by donating riches to the church. In 1320, the abbot of Kilwinning and Arbroath, Bernard of Kilwinning, was one of the most powerful men of Scotland who signed the Declaration of Arbroath, and possibly was responsible for the wording of it, asserting Scotland's position as an independent kingdom and declaring their support for King Robert the Bruce. It is believed that Abbot Bernard may be buried at Kilwinning Abbey. By the 1500s, people became more and more resentful of the abbeys and of the powerful church leaders, so they welcomed the new Protestant faith which had spread from Europe. With the invention of printing presses, Bibles were printed in English for all to read, and when the last Catholic Queen of Scotland, Mary, died, she was replaced by her son, the Protestant King James VI. In Scotland, John Knox enthusiastically led the casting down of the abbeys and monasteries. Unlike in England, where Henry VIII had actively destroyed monasteries and holy men were put to death, it was a much less violent process here. As there was no one now to pay for repairs and upkeep, the remaining monks had to endure seeing their abbey reduced to a source of free building materials for local townsfolk. The abbey became a great quarry from which much of the later town was built. The monks themselves were allowed to retire peacefully and live out their days in familiar surroundings. One of the iconic remaining parts of the abbey is the great gable wall of the south transept. It seems to date from the middle of the 13th century. In the lower levels, it would appear to stand on earlier foundations. This view, seen from the southern cloisters, shows that even in its severely weathered state, it is still a masterpiece. 3 lancet windows are stepped to make room for the roof of the monks' dormitory. Different colours of stone indicate different building periods or different quarries to source the sandstone with which it is built. There were probably several quarries used by the medieval builders. Only Goldcraigs is certain, as well as another ancient quarry site at Monkcastle and possibly West Dowra. The stone is an unusual and distinctive sandstone conglomerate, and in areas protected from centuries of weathering and pollution, it is a striking golden colour. The Abbey in all its glory must have been a dazzling sight to travellers in the Middle Ages when seen from its vantage point above the surrounding countryside. The same gable wall, viewed from what would have been the interior of the church, shows the skill and craftsmanship of the stonemasons who built it. Above the lancet windows is an oculus or round window, which is a perfect circle with a pair of short lancet windows on each side and a further lancet above. In this image you can see a passageway which runs through the wall at sill level on the 3 main lancets and the oculus. This would have been accessed by 2 spiral staircases, one at each corner of the gable. This wall dates from the 1230s. The window spaces would have been filled with magnificent stained glass. As in all monastic buildings, the processional door links the cloisters to the church. This doorway was usually built as a grand entrance to the nave from the cloisters, but in Kilwinning it is particularly dramatic both in its size and in its elaborate decoration, in contrast to the simplicity of the surrounding stonework. Through this entrance the monks would have processed during important services such as Candlemas and Easter. This beautiful doorway has some intriguing design features and unexplained anomalies which are referred to in Jim Kennedy's book The Abbey of Kilwinning. It is thought by some architectural historians that the doorway dates from between 1180 and 1200 and could therefore have been a gift or thanks offering by Richard de Morville after his safe return from the Crusades. In the middle of the medieval ruins stands the Abbey Church, built in 1774 and constructed partly with Abbey stone. It stands on the foundations of what would have been the medieval church, chancel and choir area, and it replaced the first parish church, which was built after the Reformation in 1590. Old drawings are good for giving us an impression of the Abbey ruins in later years. This one, from the 1775 Armstrong's map of Ayrshire, shows the only remaining tower at the northwest corner of the Abbey. The Papingo archery competition is taking place in this drawing, as can be seen from the archers firing arrows vertically to try and hit a wooden bird or popinjay attached to the roof of the tower. This old etching from 1789 shows the same northwest tower again, but this time, interestingly, it shows a house which has been built onto the wall separating the southern aisle from the cloisters. This much more fanciful sketch from 1802 from the Edinburgh Magazine again shows the same northwest tower, but this time shows a very different style of roof, giving it much more of a Disneyland appearance. This pastoral view of 1814 shows that the old tower had eventually fallen in ruins. In the previous year, stonemasons had been employed to make repairs to the old fabric, but too late to save it. A portion of it fell with a loud crash, and no repairs could save the remainder. After removing the two bells, it was decided to blow up the ruin with 2 barrels of gunpowder, and although only 1 barrel exploded, it collapsed into pieces. The old tower had seen so much history, including at one time being used as a prison for Bessie Graham, accused of witchcraft in 1649. Two years later, in 1816, a replacement clock tower stood in its place, designed by David Hamilton and built at a cost of £1,520, 11 shillings and 10pence. It had 4 black clock faces with gilded hands, and the newly installed clock mechanism was built by Kilwinning clockmaker James Blair. 2 bells were reinstated and were linked to the clock mechanism. The flat roof is accessed by 143 steps up an anti-clockwise spiral staircase. This view from the Abbey Green on the south side of the Abbey shows that tenement houses were built amongst the old Abbey ruins, and much of the building materials came from the Abbey itself. Soon after the Reformation, one of these houses had been occupied as a manse by Alexander Ryton until his death in 1605. With some modifications, the building remained occupied until the 1940s. In 1881, the census revealed that it was the home of 36 individuals. Above the lintel of the doorway, circled in red, was a carved abbey stone with the Latin inscription Sine te Domine cuncta nil, God is the builder, praised he be. Translated as Without you, Lord, all is nothing, this became the motto of Kilwinning Town Council. This is the same view as before and a few years later. The houses have been demolished in the green, except for one which is still there, built into the ruins of the Abbey. In the tower, the clock faces have been repainted in white, and the first floor windows have been bricked up. Today, the Abbey Tower is home to a heritage centre. To find out more, or if you'd like to join our tour volunteers, contact Kilwinning Heritage. I hope you've enjoyed this short introduction to Kilwinning Abbey. There's a lot more to find out about it if you really want to. The full story of the Abbey and the monks of Kilwinning can be found in Jim Kennedy's book, which is available from us, priced £12. You can order it online from our website, or if you live locally, contact us for free delivery.